This is Linux In-Laws, a podcast on free Libre open source software, broadcasting from the United Kingdom and Germany.
Welcome to Linux In-Laws, Season 2, Episode 46. Mr. Visser, how are things tonight?
Yeah, not bad. The week of sunshine, everything's great.
Okay, there was a
Things are
faint
moving on.
bell in the background.
I think
Is
that
that-
was Brian having a drink.
That was me. You might want to.
Okay. I
Hang
thought
on,
it was
I
just
gotta-
Martin's alarm clock, just in case to wake him up or something. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, that's later.
You know what? I'm gonna fix this right now. I'm gonna turn this app off. So
Perfect. And with that, without further ado, I mean, normally we keep bitching about the weather, UK politics, and all the rest of it. So, but let's
World
dispense with
politics,
that for the time being. Exactly. And let's introduce our
Export tariffs,
Robin
yeah.
this tonight,
Yes.
who is actually a certain Mr. Brian Proffitt. And for the 2 to 75 listeners who do not know what I'm talking about, Brian, why don't you introduce yourself?
I think it's a little bit more than 75, but we'll see. So my name is Brian Proffitt. I have a lot of different functions and activities around the open source world. In my day job, I'm a senior manager with Redhat's open source program office. I run their community outreach team, and we do a lot of things around data analytics. And for community health, we also do standard outreach like events and messaging and training. And I'm always thrilled to be a part of that activity. And then as a volunteer, I am vice president of marketing and publicity and also vice president of conferences for the Apache Software Foundation. And I'm also a member of the board for the Chaos Project, which is a Linux Foundation project around community metrics. So
yeah,
that's
we had
I
one
am.
on the podcast a few months ago. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Brian, so
I'm also fun at parties. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Got to work that in.
with all those activities, do you still have a life, I wonder?
My wife would say no.
You're married.
Well, of course. I mean, I'm very lucky in that regard.
Okay. I mean, most of the people basically with that sort of schedule would dispense with the marriage, I suppose. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I'm actually, this coming May, I will be married 35 years. And I'm very lucky in that regard. But there is a lot to balance. I do like to keep busy. Fortunately, Redhat allows me to do a lot of volunteer work for organizations like Apache and Chaos and the occasional odd things of volunteering for the OSI, for instance. So I've been very lucky in that regard that my employer lets me get involved in a lot of community activities because that is basically the nature of my job.
Going to say, I mean, as a bit of history, I think you wrote a bunch of books around Linux, right? How did you end up on a open source office at Redhat from there?
Oh my God! How long do we have?
About 4 hours and 60 minutes. So max is
okay, that'll be just about right. So let me see if I can condense this down. So I actually started my professional career as a journalist after I left school and kind of ended up in book publishing, specifically at Sam's Publishing, which did a lot of the early consumer books around how to use everything, Windows, Macs, Linux. This was a time, in the late 90s where people were still using books to, learn about how to use these computers that were coming into our lives big time around the turn of the century. And after editing for a while, I started writing those books, ended up turning that into a full-time career, eventually transitioned over to technology journalism proper. So I worked with the internet.com media outlet, which became Jupiter Media while I was there. And so that's where I started really getting more heavily involved in the open source community, managing sites like Linux Planet and Linux Today. And then one thing led to another, did a couple of years as an employee of the Linux Foundation, and ended up eventually landing over at Redhat, coming up on 11 years now with Redhat. So that's the very short version of it. So it always surprises people. I don't code. I never have. The thing that I think I do okay at is that I can learn new things and I can educate through writing or, training or teaching or whatever. And that's been my main source of contributions to the open source community. So I feel very lucky that I've been able to do that with my skill set.
Now, coming back to the Jupyterland days, it's a blog/podcasts emporium.
Well, you might be thinking of Jupyter Broadcasting, which is a completely separate entity.
Okay, which is different, okay.
Yeah, this was Jupyter Media. This was like one word, and they used to be internet.com because they actually owned that domain, and several other media websites. So they did Server Watch, Browser Watch, Linux Planet, Linux Today, all things Linux, embedded Linux. They're for a while, I was managing about 6 of their Linux and open source properties as like an editor and writer before I moved on to the Linux Foundation.
Are they still around? Do you know?
Yeah, Linux Today is still around. It's automated now. I believe it's a news aggregate site, but it was fairly popular in the day because it was a news aggregation site, but there was a lot of comment activity.
Okay.
So it was no Slashdot in terms of that kind of traffic, but there was a lot of discussion, and that actually helped me build community building skills, and also herding a lot of cats, and also a lot of disparate voices. And not everybody, unfortunately, on the internet is polite and civil. So there were some.
As we all know, yes.
Yeah, so there were some skills learned there as well. So definitely a very valuable time, and really, I think that was the first time I directly interacted with the free and open source software community. So it was invaluable to me in that respect.
And that hasn't scared you off at all, apparently.
No, so people who know me tend to know that I don't really shy away from difficult conversations. In fact, sometimes I will seek them out, which can be slightly alarming. But no, I do, in all seriousness, I recognize that everybody has a passion. Everybody approaches things in their own way. And even if they're coming across as being somewhat of a jerk, to put it mildly, it is an expression of their passion. So you have to kind of get beyond that and say, okay, well, what's really driving this? Is this coming from a place of passion? Is this coming from a place of fear, or whatever? And I find that if you're patient enough, most of the time you can get through that bravado and difficult personality issues and move into what really matters. Nothing's ever 100% successful, but that's typically my goal.
Okay.
And so I try to use a lot of humor. Definitely a lot of self-deprecation.
With that sort of traits, how come that you're not running Tesla or something called DOGE as a Department of Government Efficiency? Just wondering.
Because I'm not a billionaire who inherited a lot of money from my
It's also not open source, really, are they?
Yeah, but this has nothing to do with open source. I'm just wondering in general, you see. Because he just described something, I reckon, very close to a guy called Elon Musk, no? I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Well, like what, in terms of how I approach things or in terms of how to
the traits you just described are very close to Elon's heart, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. But obviously I have some strong disagreements with the way things are going, and I don't know if we want to get into a political discussion, but
we can.
Right.
We normally try to steer it clear, but you're more than welcome.
Martin does, but I don't anyway. So Brian, just speak your mind.
I think that, I'm not sure I agree with that assessment as far as Elon goes, because, So you can use the same methodologies and the same way to talk to people and discuss things and get to the heart of matters and things like that. But I would think that my motivation is a little bit different because, as I said earlier, I think the key thing that drives me is to educate and inform. And I would say that Elon Musk's primary motivation is not that. Let's put it that way. So,
fair point. Yes.
And so, but I think that, that doesn't belie the fact that you can use similar approaches to conversations and community bridge building. Although, honestly, until you said that, I'd never really given that much thought around him, to be honest.
You see, Linus in-laws at the end of the day is also about kind of challenging people and turning things around in a very, what's what I'm for Martin, weird way, I suppose? I don't know. As in, we have had quite a few guests, full disclosure now, on the show that came out different, let's put it this way. Not in an asylum way of things, but rather almost a changed personality, Martin, right? More or less.
I guess you could say that. Yeah, for sure.
Linus, if you're listening, you weren't one of them. Anyway.
Well, he's yet to turn up, right?
Yes, indeed.
Feel free to recommend this, Brian, if you meet him later. Yeah.
Oh, the all 2 times I've met him personally, I don't know if he's going to take my personal recommendation that highly.
He takes many personal recommendations.
He tends to be difficult at times. I don't know.
I've heard that. Yes, I'll be more circumspect. He's actually not. I'm at a Linux Foundation event right now, and he's not here. So,
well, he has kids and a wife, no?
Yeah, but getting back to what we were talking about, I think, for me, like, I know meritocracy can be used as a bad word, and it certainly can be it can be abused at times. But I am a firm believer in, like, if a project, an individual project, or even an entire ecosystem is run appropriately, there's a lot of room for people to demonstrate their talents, not based on where they're coming from or where they live or what's going on in their lives. It's just the talent that they bring. And so I think that we as a collective community can really ride that to a path of success if we do it collectively and do it appropriately. I've also seen meritocracy used as an excuse to gatekeep. And I grew up in Indiana in the central U.S., and if you're not familiar with people in Indiana, we tend to be a very egalitarian and straightforward people. That's probably where my personality comes from. And so we don't like people who put on airs, to use that phrase. And I think that that's a big part of what shapes my approach to community building, is that there are no, like, everybody has an equal say. And sometimes they can be wrong, but I think that, they at least deserve a chance to be heard.
Kind of how democracy works.
Yeah.
You may not agree with the result. Yeah.
Right. I use this quote, and I wish I remembered who actually said it, but, democracy is, not a great form of government, but it is probably the best form of government that we have right now, until somebody invents something better. So, yeah.
People have tried, and failed.
Mm-hmm. Having grown up in the 70s in the United States, I would strongly argue that even the most liberal Democrat is probably far to the right of the Democrats that were around when I was a child. A lot of people don't recall this, but if you go back and look at the policies of Richard Nixon, and not necessarily the, all the kerfuffle at the end of his administration and the personal issues he had, if you look at it actually as policies, Richard Nixon was, for a Republican, far left of anything that we would have as a Republican in the United States now. And so I think progressively over time, at least, and I can only speak for the United States, things have moved farther and farther politically to the right. I think that's a product of our aging population. The baby boomer population here is getting older and they are mostly retired now. They are, and unfortunately, sadly, they're passing on. And I think what we're seeing now is a bit of a reaction from that generation, which still holds a very large segment of the voting population and certainly the wealth in the United States. I think what we're seeing is a reaction to new ideas that, frankly, make them uncomfortable at best and make them fearful at worst. And I think the real challenge to bridge the gap between any kind of political division is to, and this gets back to what I was talking about with free and open source software, I think it gets back to where's the fear? What things are we most afraid of? Because I think when you get right down to it, the things that people are scared of really aren't that scary at all. And I think there's a lot more common ground for people when they have these conversations, whether we're talking about tech or politics or anything like that.
But before we tackle that scale issue, let's go back to uni days. Wasn't about open source at all, was it?
No. That was actually, so that was just, so I didn't go to school at Notre Dame, although I did grow up in that city. I went to a smaller school in Indiana. But at Notre Dame, I was literally teaching the sophomores in the business school the spreadsheets and database class, which was Excel and Microsoft Access. And most of the work that I was doing was around those tools. So even though that they're proprietary, those are the tools that are going to be found in Business More. And Google Sheets has matured, of course, and it is coming along. But I know it might be blasphemy to say this on a podcast, but feature for feature, I still think that Excel is probably the best spreadsheet tool. As far as Access goes, I always tell my students, look, I'm here to teach you relational databases and how they work. I said, if you ever see this tool in the wild, you should run screaming. And I, of course, did a lot of education around more common databases like MySQL and, anything that was open source in that regard. And when I was teaching there, non-relational databases were coming into the fore. And I would teach them about, as much as I could around non-relational databases as I could. So, yeah. So
how did you arrive at open source?
So really what ended up happening was when I was at Sam's Publishing, Linux was really just coming into popularity as a potential consumer platform. And Sam's Publishing, actually, not a lot of people knew this, but in the old days, when this is before Red Hat Enterprise Linux or even like Fedora, Sam's Publishing was the exclusive distributor of the documentation that you would get if you went to a store and bought a copy of Red Hat Linux. I mean, we're talking, let's see, when did I start working there? My second daughter was in 97. So yeah. So we're talking like, this is 95, 96, And so when you bought a copy of Red Hat Linux and there was a big, how-to guide inside the box with the CD, Sam's Publishing was the company that actually put that book together. So they had an early and invested interest in doing books and guides around open source technology. So, and so I was editing those quite a bit, and then eventually ended up writing them. I think the first Linux book that I did was it was around Open Caldera. And once I installed that for the first time, I was hooked. And I actually, except for like work things like, the course I taught at Notre Dame, I don't really use Windows or Macs anymore. I've been a Linux user of some distro since the late 90s. And it's always funny because Open Caldera ended up becoming SCO, and then that caused a problem later in the early 2000s. So, but, I've used a lot of other distros since.
Details for the younger audience may or may not be in the show notes. Of course, what Brian's referring to is the SEO lawsuit and what came out of it. But as we only have about 7 hours of podcast episode length, details will be in the show notes, people. But not to worry about this. Brian, coming back on much more serious issues, you just mentioned a very interesting aspect, namely community management and building. Since this podcast is along similar lines, what are the challenges, the beauties, and simply how you do it in terms of how do you actually foster a community around an open source project, and what are the challenges or what are the not so nice things about it? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So now this is my day job. So lots of thoughts. Obviously, there are lots of challenges to community building and community management. And everybody has a different take and a different focus. My particular personal focus is on how do we onboard people into communities as contributors. Onboarding people as users is, relatively speaking, easier than getting new contributors on board. And that's always been true. And what I think the challenge is for any new or even existing communities is how do we get people involved in a new community and make that transition as easy as possible so they can start contributing. And these days, this is less and less of a problem, but even as early as like 5 or 6 years ago, communities would fail to do fundamental things. And for me, for onboarding, there's a fundamental principle around 3 basic things. You have to, when somebody comes to your project, whether it's a website or a GitHub page or whatever, they have to know 3 things right off the bat. What does this project do? How does it work? And how do they get it? And then the 4th thing, and that's for users in general, and then the 4th thing for contributors is how do they contribute to the community? And those seem like very common sense. Yeah, no kidding, Brian. That's not rocket science. But there are a lot of communities that don't do that, because for one reason or another, they have, even with the best of intentions, they've closed themselves off to new contributors. Because think about it, you get into a project with some people that you worked with them or you met them somewhere and you've got common interests and common passion. And, 5 or 6 or a dozen people throw themselves into an open source project. They start building this really remarkable tool. They're passionate. It's great. It is a natural human reaction to not necessarily be happy when newcomers come along. And this, because
it's interesting you say that, because most community projects, they always need help, right? So it's something that seems a little bit illogical or illogical. Yes, exactly. And you hit upon the problem, because they will say, "Oh my God, we need help," but then they don't necessarily have entry ramps, to use the American road phrase, right, to get into the community. And yet they desperately need the help. So things like
the three things that four things that you mentioned.
Is that something that the Linux Foundation could help with, organize these projects better?
Well, maybe. I mean, I think everybody can do this. I don't think it's necessarily the Linux Foundation alone.
No, but it's kind of obviously we've seen the Linux Foundation taking on a lot of projects, right? So if they have that as a kind of standard or guideline for these,
sure, I would say they could help with this, but I think that they also have a long way to go because they are responsible for the Linux kernel. And onboarding in the Linux kernel community is historically not easy. And there's merit to that. I'm not trying to criticize the Linux kernel project. It should be.
Feel free.
No. I can criticize it, but to make this point, I don't have to.
Okay.
Certain projects are always going to be harder to join than other because they're technically difficult. The learning curve is tricky or whatever, and also they have a huge impact, so you don't want to make it easy. What I'm arguing is we should be able to make it easier. So like one common thing that most projects don't necessarily think about is, okay, do you have a contributor guide? Like if I want to submit a patch, how do I do it? Because there's no universal way to do this, and all these projects have their own different ways, and you can't just assume one project's contribution process is the same as another's. So do you have a contributor guide? Is there a known path to, well, first off, find maintainers? Like if I'm submitting things, who's going to decide whether or not this patch is acceptable? What's the process there? Who's doing it? And then if I want to stay in this project, is there a path forward for me? If I get to be a really good developer and really engaged in this project, is there a path forward for me to become a maintainer or a member of whatever governance system they have in place? A lot of projects don't do this. They sort of do it like ad hoc, and they say, oh yeah, so-and-so's been around for 10 years. We should make them a maintainer. Well, okay, that's great. But if so-and-so wasn't willing to wait around for 10 years, or if so-and-so didn't even know that's what they were supposed to do because it was never spelled out for them, you could run the risk of them moving on to another project where they might feel more appreciated, or their work is more valued. Because even when we're getting paid to do this by our employers, and a lot of us are right now, there's still that extra layer of, is my work valued? Am I appreciated? Do I have a chance to influence this project more? No matter what my motivation is, whether I'm a paid employee or I'm doing this as a volunteer.
Do you have any examples of where this is done right?
Ooh,
if there aren't any.
Yeah, well, okay.
We do have another 6 hours. So.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to give you dead air. So
no worries. Take your time, Ryan. No worries.
Actually, the problem was I was thinking about there's like 500 of them I can think of. So I think the most common example of this would probably be in the Kubernetes space. The CNCF, and even before it came to the CNCF, when it belonged to Google, they did a really good job of onboarding. And when you got to the Kubernetes space and you started contributing, you knew what you were getting.
Brian, sorry, for the two listeners who haven't listened to the previous episode about the CNCF, we should probably explain what the CNCF is.
Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It is under the Linux Foundation umbrella, and they are responsible for a great many cloud-oriented projects, which includes the Kubernetes project and the related ecosystem.
This was the understatement. Yeah, and this was the understatement of the century, because the CNCF is actually driving most of the cloud workloads. Of course, there is a previous episode of the Linux in-laws, details will be in the show notes, that did actually have the CNCF on the show. So for the details, sorry to interrupt, Brian, listen to the previous episode. Sorry, Brian.
Okay. No, absolutely. No. If you can, I know I don't have all day to describe it, but I think getting back to my original point, I think that the Kubernetes community in general is one that does this fairly well. Nobody's perfect. There are always gaps and bumps, but I do admire the way that they pulled this together. This is a huge project. It's a huge ecosystem. But when people join the Kubernetes community, I think that they do very well. There are Apache projects that do this very well. Obviously, I'm biased since I volunteer at that organization. Apache Tomcat comes to mind. Let's see, the Apache HTTPD project. There are several of them in Apache land that do a pretty good job of making sure everybody knows how to join, how to contribute, how to succeed at a given project. And that's really a big part of what is referred to as the Apache way. So
full
it's not surprising.
Yeah, full disclosure, the Linux in-laws do use Apache as their main web server, among other things.
Yeah.
So we have been using this web server for 5 years since the podcast has been incepted, and I've been using Apache for the last 12, maybe 14 years. So kudos to the Apache Software Foundation as an ASF, who came up with the initial web server, I think, as one of its original projects, if I'm not completely mistaken.
That was the first manifestation of what would end up becoming the Apache Foundation. That particular web server, because back in that day, the only other game in town was Microsoft's Internet Information Server.
Ouch.
Yeah. It's been a long time since I've said those words out loud, and I'm just like, that's still weird to say.
Kids, for the younger ones among you, this is ancient technology. This is legacy. It's obsolete. Don't go near it. It's almost toxic waste. Let's put it this way.
Man, if I ever found a website that was running IIS, that would be horrific. Yeah, maybe we should have added in the bio at the beginning of this that I'm like 58 years old, so there's going to be a lot of old-timey stuff out here. If you have to annotate everything I said.
We found the hipster. Excellent. Because Martin and myself are way older than 58. Okay? Great. So Brian, you use Rust and TypeScript. If you do program at all, because I mentioned you mentioned that you didn't program, so fair enough.
I don't program at all. So I think the only code, if you want to be strict about it, the only code I know is HTML and CSS, and that's not. I mean, I've had people say, "Yeah, that's kind of coding," and I'm like, "No, it doesn't really feel like it."
Well, CSS is a Turing complete language, no?
Yeah, I guess, but no, I don't. Professionally, because I have a team of data scientists at my job. Obviously, I focus on things that are Python related because I need to keep up with them. And the associates on my team. So obviously there's a lot of discussion around Python. And we use that pretty extensively at Redhat too. So we're big supporters of the Python community and their tool set.
So Brian, word of advice, if you really want to live up to that hipster image that I kind of try to portray, you want to maybe look into lots of some other languages. Sorry, but we shouldn't make fun of our guests, I suppose. Go ahead.
I was going to actually comment on your Apache Software Foundation part. Probably 10 years ago or more, a lot of projects were joining under the Apache Foundation, right? And that seems to have more recently been moved over or more in favor of the Linux Foundation, where new projects are kind of joining under that umbrella instead. Is that how do you think that happened?
So I think those foundations offer different things to different projects. So fundamentally, the organizations, they're both nonprofits, and I'll kind of walk through this for those people who are not based in the U.S. and also are not familiar with U.S. tax policy. But even though they're both nonprofits, there are certain tax regulations that apply to different kinds of nonprofits. So in the U.S., germane to this conversation, the Apache Software Foundation falls under the regulations that are known as 501c3. And a 501c3 is a nonprofit that is essentially what you would think of as a charitable organization that is doing something for the public good. And that is how Apache is regulated. And so we are doing work for literally the public good. The Linux Foundation and Cloud Native and Eclipse, which is based in Europe, so they have a slightly different name for it, and I can't remember off the top of my head what they call it in the EU. But they are what in the US they would be referred to as a 501c6,
which
is a 501c6 is. I'm sorry.
Which is a marketing organization or an industry marketing organization. So in Europe, that would be
trade
called
organization. Yeah.
Exactly, trade organization. So in Europe, I reckon it's fair to say that this would be a communist spread the word organization. I'm joking, of course.
Yeah. And a trade organization is there. It is a nonprofit, but is there to benefit its members. So not necessarily the public good. So, and I'm not trying to take a moral high ground here. I'm just saying these are different ways of approaching the thing. So something like the Linux Foundation, when a project joins that, they're going to gain immediate business benefits, hopefully, if they're successful, because other people in the organization will use the software, contribute to the software, and you should, if all things go well, gain an immediate network effect. Whereas if you come into the Apache Foundation, there the idea is to create a community and ecosystem around a given software project that functions appropriately and sustainably in an open source way. In 1999, when the Apache Foundation was created, this was a revolutionary concept because really Apache was the only game in town as far as open source was concerned, and so people would learn quite a bit about how open source and open source communities work just by going through what is now referred to as the Apache incubation process. Now, I think one of the challenges for Apache is that we still have the incubation process. It's a great process, but it's also something that was created a while ago. And there are conversations within the Apache Foundation about, okay, is this something that we can streamline? Is this something we can make it easier? Because people who come to us today don't need to be necessarily completely educated in all things open source. There will be gaps in their knowledge, but it's not like it was 26 years ago where they knew nothing about open source. So that's something that the Apache Foundation, I've had conversations with board directors and other vice presidents and members, and we've talked about, is this something we can do? Is this something we should do? Streamline. Whereas on the Linux Foundation side, and I say this is going to sound like I'm criticizing, their goal is to make their members succeed. So projects that come into the Linux Foundation are going to have a completely different onboarding situation, because the goal there is to have the commercial member who submitted the project succeed commercially. So there's much more of an element of capitalism there versus community building. And again, I'm not saying that disparagingly. It's just the way it's approached. And
how would you define? Sorry, how would you define that success under the Linux Foundation? In that case, you mentioned commercially successful, but what does that mean, right? It's going to be
making money. I mean, it's
yes.
simple. Like it's as simple as that. I'm not saying that and I want to be very careful here. I'm not saying that the Linux Foundation and the Eclipse Foundation and similar organizations do not care about community building. They do. But it may not be their primary goal necessarily because, again, a trade organization is there to benefit its members. So to be successful, if you're a corporation, by default, your definition of success is how much money are you bringing in to your pocketbook? How much revenue are you generating? That is the overarching goal. And the Linux Foundation, I honestly think they have a little bit of a tougher job because they have to get these incoming projects in line with open source best practices, and with that overarching commercial success in mind. And I'm not saying that, Apache projects aren't commercially successful. They absolutely are. But when you come to Apache, the overarching goal is the open source best practices and the community best practices. So it's just a different focus.
Okay. Does the Linux Foundation do any sort of tracking, bookkeeping of that success criteria?
I mean, I'm sure they do, and obviously I don't know what they do along their individual projects, but because they're a nonprofit based in the U.S., they do have all nonprofits are required, whether they're a C6 or a C3, they're required to report their tax returns, which comes with their budget. It's one of the things you have to do if you are going to be a nonprofit in the United States. But individually, collectively, no, I don't think that data is public. I could be wrong, and if somebody wants to correct me, I'm happy to be corrected. But I have never seen numbers along like how much money is Kubernetes making. I think what happens there is so Redhat has a Kubernetes distribution called OpenShift. And so Red Hat knows what it's selling with OpenShift, and we know our numbers. But I don't know, that's not necessarily reported up through the Linux Foundation.
Well, it's also going to be tricky because there's a whole bunch of contributors who are paid by various organizations and not. And so how do you account for those, right? That's going to be, if you look at most projects, if you were to count all those salaries, then that would probably be very hard to make something profitable, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. But the different foundations and obviously even amongst the 501c6s, like Linux Foundation handles things differently than the Eclipse Foundation, and Apache is a 501c3. We handle things differently than the Software Freedom Conservancy. So even though they're in the same tax regulation, all the foundations, offer something unique to their members and also to their constituent projects. It's really a matter of looking for, what's going to suit you best. Yeah,
and you I mean, we had an episode on chaos, and you're also a member of that, but they look at completely different metrics in terms of successfulness of a project, right?
Yeah, so chaos is one of those. Not every LF project. You're right. You actually brought up a good counterexample. Not every LF project is there to be commercially successful. They do projects that are helpful and utilitarian for the rest of the open source community. And obviously community health metrics, for those of your listeners who listen to your chaos episode, that's going to benefit everybody, not only inside the Linux Foundation, but everybody in the open source ecosystem. And at Red Hat, we use chaos-based tools, and we built our own metrics software around that. And we partnered with the University of Missouri because they have a great chaos project software called Augur. We put that together with our tool set, and we're building hopefully a dashboard that anybody can come in and point it at a GitHub repo or GitLab repo or organization and determine through metrics the health of their community. And Red Hat's not doing that as a product, right? We're not doing that to sell anything. We're doing that because we need it, because everything we do is in open source land. And knowing what our constituent project's health is very important. And we're willing to also share this information with anybody who wants to come in and use it.
That's interesting from a, let's say, Red Hat perspective. There, when you mention health and projects, would that be a reason for your office to spend more efforts on community outreach and events and things like that, or would it be a case of
or something? No, that's a great question. Kind of. I mean, it's part of the conversation. So it's funny you mentioned that. So one of the things I do in my job is help determine what community events we're going to go to. And so when I say community events, I'm referring to not trade organization events like Mobile World Congress or something like that. That is obviously just a gigantic telecom trade industry event. I'm referring to community events like Open Source Summit or Scale in Los Angeles or I'm sorry, Pasadena, and All Things Open in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Texas Linux Fest. And those are, and FOSDEM to some degree in Brussels. Those are all what we would call community events. So when Red Hat and other companies go to community events, it's like, okay, what are you getting out of it? Because we're really not going to get a sale out of that. Not really. I mean, if we want to sell anything, we're probably going to have more success at something like KubeCon or something like that. And I know it's like, open source people tend to shy away from, when we talk about things capitalistically oriented, but it's like, yeah, but we all have to eat too. So when we go to a community event, it's like in the old days, it was like, well, of course we're going to a community event because we want to go there and, be a part of that community, and we want to represent ourselves, and we want to support other community projects. And that is still very much true. But now with the success of open source and the global nature of open source's success, there are a million events. And I'm only speaking slightly with slight hyperbole that we can go to. I mean, FOSS Asia, Everything Open in Australia. I mean, these are events that are around the world. I just got back from DEF CONF India in Pune in India a couple weeks ago. There's a lot of events out there where we can, be a part of and support communities. So Red Hat, we are trying to determine how do we do that better and more efficiently. We're not really trying to decide like, okay, well, maybe we're not going to go to this event anymore. That's not the conversation. The conversation is when we go to these events, what's going to be the most useful for the people who are coming to meet us, and what can we get out of it? Because for us, at a community event, we're not going to be selling anything really. We're going to be probably trying to get more people involved in our projects. And how do we do that? How do we get more volunteers, whether they're, new developer enthusiasts or they're students or they're veteran developers who are looking for a new project to work on? How do we get them engaged with our projects? And so that's a big conversation that my team, both my team inside of the Open Source Program Office and the entire Open Source Program Office is having right now. And we're really excited about it. And getting back to your original question, because that's what triggered this long answer, was, metrics is going to be part of that conversation as well. Because hypothetically, we could go to an event like Scale, which is one of my favorite events, so I like to use it, and say, okay, let's say we go to Scale, we've got a big concerted push. We want people to be involved in Project X. And we can use metrics later, like 2 or 3 weeks down the line or a couple months down the line, and we can see if there was a commensurate increase in contributors in Project X. And that might demonstrate that our methodologies were successful. And if it wasn't, then we have data to work on and say, okay, well, maybe we should change our approach. So we'll use data science and experimental methods to figure out what works.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it's obviously as a commercial company, being there for profit, you have to have some kind of benefit to this. But measuring it in terms of people getting involved in the projects that you personally or as a company build is obviously a good metric there. Changing a little bit, you mentioned veterans, right, a moment ago. Open source has been around for quite some time now, and clearly with projects like Linux and Postgres as well, and MySQL, they've been around for many, many years, right? And there is kind of what people say is a bit of a generation gap has been evolving, where all the steering committee people are white-haired and been around the block for many years.
Couldn't make it?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I realize I fall into this demographic, but there's a lot of old white dudes running around, and so we collectively as a community, I've been pushing this for years, inside and outside of Redhat. We can't lean on community veterans or superstars or rock stars or whatever you want to call them. We can't do that anymore. And this is a big part of why I push onboarding so hard.
Yeah.
Because in all seriousness, in the US, given my age, I am 10 to 12 years away from retirement. And I'm going to retire. There's going to be a beach, and there's not going to be, there's not going to be a lot of community volunteering anymore. Maybe a little, but realistically, no. There's going to be a beach and my wife and my dog and a margarita. People like me are aging out, and it's not that far away. And both inside of Redhat on my team and in communities, I want us to have more early career people. I want us to have more younger people. I want us to have people who are coming from different parts of the world and engaging in these open source and free software projects. Because I am concerned that, I don't want to perpetuate the myth that the older generation knows everything, but you can't also ignore the fact that there would be a potentially large loss of knowledge as people leave the community for one reason or another. And I think that's why people of a certain age, I think we are obligated to try our best to get more people in, whether it's mentoring or making concerted recruitment efforts and projects, whatever you need to do. I think that's super important for us, because I don't want to live in a world where we lose all this open source knowledge and you have a corporate capitalist mentality from some companies that are like, open source is really hard. I think we should do open core or source available or whatever you want to do. And we see that now.
Yep.
And and so I just think that's super important. I don't know how to say that without being repetitive. And that's a big part of what drives me.
Okay, that works when you have project managed by committee, right? But there's clearly some dictatorship-led ones as well still, so that's going to be even harder, right? But,
right. Well, and it gets what I was saying earlier about, like, what are the paths to success? Because if you have something that's run, even the most benevolent dictator for life model, there's a gap. There's like there's that, whatever you want to call it, the glass ceiling or just a ceiling in general. If people don't think that they're going to be, like, not everybody comes into a project and they want to lead it. But if the opportunity is not there and they do want to do it, that's going to drive that person away. Some people come in and they just want, man, just leave me alone. I want to code. I like to code. I like to build things. That's all I want to do. Great. But that's not everybody's motivation. And if you have all these like blockers for community growth and personal growth within a community, that's going to really, I think down the line, that's going to come around and bite you on the butt.
Agreed, but there's hope at the end of the day, because two names come to mind, and we had them on the podcast previously. Of course, links will be in the show notes. There's Julia, a Fedora actually community and manager, as an engineering manager, and there's of course Carl George looking after the EPL for Redhat in themselves. So, and I'm tempted to say, because I both know them, well, Julia, of course, because I get to meet her on a regular basis. She's way younger than I am. So there's hope at the end of the day.
There is. And I think we've made great progress there. I didn't want to give the impression that we're not making progress, but we have to keep up on it.
Absolutely.
And I have seen some evidence, unfortunately, that as some people are getting older, they're kind of taking that approach where they're kind of leaning on the past a little bit more than they should. And they feel like, well, I should be recognized as a leader in this community for all the things I used to do and what I did. And while I am not taking away any measure of accomplishment there, for me, I think it's important to keep working. I think some maniacs might say, yeah, Brian, you're successful in this community. You can just sit around and pontificate all day. But for me, that's just like, that's insane. I feel like you've got to still participate. And also, for the love of God, be willing to learn. I learn new things from my team every day. And these are people who are younger than my children. And I'm still willing to learn from them, and I'm able to learn from them. And I think if we all took a little bit more of that mentality, I think our communities would be healthier by far, and get around what you described as the BFDL situation. But not every community is perfect, and not all people are perfect. So I think it will be a constant challenge to make this happen.
So people, you heard it here first. There is hope at the end of the day beyond margaritas for Brian on the beach.
Yeah.
In a couple of years to come.
That is the goal. Yes.
Okay, Brian, that has been more than insightful. Let's wrap this up. And of course, being the Linux in-laws as they are, the POXs are, of course, a very important part of wrapping the show up in terms of the outros. So, Brian, without further ado, what's your POX as a pick of the week?
My POX is, as I mentioned, I'm attending the Linux Member Summit here in Napa, California this week, and I'm very excited to see the work that is being done by the Linux Foundation about the CRA, the Cyber Resiliency Act that came out of the EU this past summer. That regulation, once, it's enacted now, and it's going to drastically affect and I believe improve security around open source software. The joke that I always tell is, when Log4j happened in 2024 or 3 rather, the world's governments finally figured out what we, the nerds, knew all along, is that open source software really is running the world.
Absolutely.
And so, well, we knew that because we're nerds. But the politicians suddenly figured it out about 2 or 3 years ago. And now we're seeing things like the CRA and possibly commensurate or equivalent, rather, regulations in the United States and other jurisdictions. But anyway, back to my POCs, I was really excited. I was part of a couple-hour discussion just this morning that the Linux Foundation was hosting around their efforts around the CRA. I'm excited to be a part of those discussions. I think that there's going to be some great progress made by the Linux Foundation and also a related group that's being spearheaded by the Eclipse Foundation that Apache is part of. I think those two working groups and others are taking a really great collaborative approach to solving this problem. And I'm excited about it because when the CRA first came out, there was a lot of nervousness. So I'm really pleased to see the progress that's being made around that to date.
Yeah, and I reckon somebody I know called Simon Phillips had a very important part to play on this. More on this maybe in a later show. The CRA is a very important part of the communist Europe, but as I said, more on this maybe later. Over to you, Martin. What's your POX?
My POX is it's two parts really. One is we haven't actually had the Grafana project on the show, but I have to say it's one of the most used and well-developed projects out there. But more to the point is something that I've been using is something called Grafana Renderer, which is rather nice to pull out your Grafana charts and things into images.
Sweet.
Is kind of
and Grafana probably
into that kind of thing.
Grafana probably being the most used UI for something called Prometheus, right? So, which is part of the any container ecosystem called Kubernetes and beyond, of course. Indeed. And my POX, without further delays, a movie, come to think of it, called Back in Action. I won't give away too much, but IMDb gives
Are you starring in this?
No, funny enough, I'm not.
Does it have to be with?
No. It's a Hollywood caper. IMDb gives it almost 6. I'm tempted to say it's a solid 7.2. It's if you know Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Yep. You don't want to know exactly. You don't want to miss this one. I'm not talking about the TV series as of last year. I'm talking about the original movie exactly of 2005, because Back in Action depicts a middle-aged couple being thrown back into the spy game and the shenanigans evolving from this. So if you're into that sort of comedy, you don't want to miss this. And as I said, it's very much like Mr. and Mrs. Smith with the kids about 20 years fast forward. And with that, Brian, thank you very much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much.
It has been a pleasure. And we must have you back in a couple of years' time from the beach, of course.
Well, in a couple of years' time might not be the beach, but you never know. Hopefully, if I win the lottery.
Hey, we could do an on-site recording on the beach.
There you go.
We will join you, exactly. And
there you go.
And with that, thank you for listening. This is the Linux In-Laws.
You come for the knowledge,
but stay for the madness.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you liked this feature presentation. If so, please spread the word. If not, please let us know. Feedback at linuxinlaws.eu.